I'm Lauren Ellis, 27, and the morning Stephen Cole called me to his office, the sky over the old Victorian on Maple Street looked the color of slate. I stood at the gate with my umbrella closed, trying to quiet the tremor in my hand. The brass nameplate on the door felt colder than I remembered, as if it knew something I didn't. In the window's reflection, I looked like a child again, the one who used to practice scales until her fingers ached. Somewhere behind that glass, words waited that would change the way my family spoke my name. A week earlier, a state trooper had said, "I'm sorry," and the world dropped a gear I couldn't find again. Today felt like the moment the car stops coasting and hits the hill. I took the handle, breathed once, and walked inside. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever held your ground when it cost you comfort. Tap like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I teach piano in a small studio above a florist downtown, the kind of place that smells like lilies in spring and warm dust in August. My days are a steady rhythm of metronomes, sticky keys, and bright faces that light up when a simple melody finally holds together. The income is lean, but the work is honest, and I was raised to believe that how you earn your bread matters just as much as the bread itself. My grandfather, Bill Ellis, taught me that on quiet Sundays, at his old upright, his voice low, his hand resting lightly on middle C, while he said, "Money can buy a bench, Lauren, but not the reason you sit at it." He wore suits longer than most people keep cars, and drove the same pickup to the office because it still ran. He cared more about listening than being seen. With him, I felt seen not for what I could bring to a table, but for the way I showed up and stayed. The house where I grew up was different. My father, Thomas, kept calendars full of names that mattered to him and the deals he wanted to close with them. My mother, Karen, measured weeks in galas and garden parties, always aware of who noticed her dress and who didn't. Brandon, my younger brother, moved through rooms as if they were made to clear for him, and to be fair, they usually did. At dinner, conversation bent toward prestige: who bought which car, who joined which board, who sat where, at whose fundraiser. I learned early to keep my stories short, to leave out the kind of pride that can't be photographed. A shy student's first clean chord, a parent's eyes filling when their child plays without looking down. The more my world filled with simple wins, the more theirs leaned toward the kind that arrives in wire transfers and headlines. I didn't resent them. I made my own home in the spaces they hurried past. On free Saturdays, I'd take the train to my grandfather's place, a brick house that never felt like a museum, even though it could have. We baked too many cookies in a kitchen, with sun-washed tile, walked the garden paths he tended himself, and played chess badly by the fire. He told stories about starting with a desk he shared, and a company that existed only as a folder of notes, and he never framed those years as before. He said those were the years that built his hands. When he laughed, the sound stayed in the room, and when he listened, he leaned forward like words had weight. I didn't know to call that love then. I just knew that around him my lungs remembered how full they could get. The call from Sergeant Mark Douglas came on a Tuesday, the hour when light disappears, and you notice how loud the refrigerator is. He said my grandfather's name first, then the rest. Collision drunk driver didn't make it. The apartment went quiet except for the pen bleeding a dark crescent across a lesson chart I'd been grading. I had a concert program tucked on my fridge with his name circled. He'd promised to be there and ask afterward how my shyest student did with the left hand. Grief is odd in how it counts time. A minute can feel like a hallway with no doors. I sat through the service a few days later and watched familiar faces turn their sadness toward cameras, watched others whisper numbers, as if grief and arithmetic share a language. If there's a kind of silence worse than the one after a goodbye, it's the kind that follows a smile held too long for a photographer. Stephen Cole called 2 weeks later, his voice careful and unhurried. He asked me to come in at 9 sharp and to bring immediate family. The walk to his office felt like crossing a wooden bridge you've trusted your whole life, only to feel a new give under your feet. The lobby smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the same as it had when I was 16, and my grandfather stopped by to sign something and took me out for pie afterward. I smoothed my skirt on the chair outside the conference room and heard my father's voice down the hall, brisk and certain, with my mother's answering murmur, warm enough to frost the edges. Brandon swung around the corner with his phone in his hand, and the kind of grin you wear when you think the story already knows its ending. I didn't have a speech. I had a memory of a hand on middle C and a sentence about why people sit down to play in the first place. Stephen opened the door and the room showed me the table. I remembered long and patient, surrounded by chairs that can make anyone look important. He greeted each of us by name and asked us to take our seats, then set a leather folder in the center with a careful palm, as if placing a frame around something that could not be rushed. Through the window, the sky finally broke a thin wash of light along the edge of the courthouse roof across the street. Stephen's eyes moved from my father to my mother to Brandon, then settled on me as if to make sure I was breathing. He cleared his throat, opened the folder, and said there were statements to be read and instructions my grandfather left for this moment. That was when the doorknob clicked once, and the room pulled tight like a held note waiting to resolve. The moment Stephen began reading, the air in that room changed. Every tick of the wall clock grew louder, like it was counting down to something none of us were ready to face. He unfolded the document slowly, his voice steady, almost gentle, as he said, "William Ellis, being of sound mind and body, hereby declares this his final will and testament." My mother adjusted her pearl necklace. My father leaned back in his chair with the air of a man expecting good news, and Brandon drummed his fingers on the polished wood, bored and restless. I kept my eyes on the lawyer's face, trying to read what he already knew. Then Stephen continued, "To my granddaughter, Lauren Ellis, I leave the entirety of my estate, financial holdings and properties valued at approximately $7 billion. The room went silent so completely that for a second I thought I'd imagined it. My father's chair screeched against the floor as he stood up, his expression snapping from disbelief to fury. "That's not possible," he barked. "He would never bypass his own son." My mother's hand trembled, but she hid it by clutching her purse. $7 billion to a piano teacher," she whispered, almost choking on the words. Brandon ripped off his sunglasses, his voice cracking with anger. "What about me? He promised to fund my company." Stephen didn't flinch. Mr. Ellis anticipated this reaction. He made it very clear this was his choice, his deliberate and final decision. My father's face turned red, veins rising at his temples. "He wasn't in his right mind," he shouted. "Someone must have manipulated him." His gaze shot toward me, sharp and accusing. "You!" My heart raced, but my voice came out steady. I didn't even know he changed his will. Stephen pressed a small button on the remote beside him, and the flat screen behind the desk flickered to life. My grandfather appeared in his favorite leather chair, his hands folded over the cane he always kept beside him. His voice filled the room, measured, calm, impossible to argue with. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone." Thomas Karen Brandon. I love you, but I can no longer overlook what you've become. Greed has blinded you. You see me as a wallet, not as a father or a grandfather. Lauren is different. She visits because she cares, not because she wants. She has integrity. She will carry our name with dignity. No one spoke when the video ended. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that stayed perfectly white. My father's hands curled into fists. Brandon muttered something under his breath I couldn't catch. Then my father leaned over the table, his voice low and shaking. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, Lauren. You can't defy your family." His words fell like threats rather than promises. Stephen closed the folder, his tone professional but firm. "Mr. Ellis contesting this will would be both costly and futile. Every measure your father took is documented. His capacity was tested by independent specialists." My father stared at him as though daring him to blink. "We'll see about that." When I left the office, the world outside felt different, too bright, too sharp. I drove home on autopilot, my fingers gripping the steering wheel hard enough to ache. I kept hearing my grandfather's voice, that quiet certainty when he said I would carry his legacy. I didn't know if I could live up to that, but I knew I wouldn't betray it. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Come home at 6. We'll settle this as a family. No greeting, no question mark, just an order." I should have known what it meant, but a small part of me hoped it was an olive branch. When I walked into my parents' house, the lights were low, the air heavy with the scent of my mother's perfume. My father stood by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand. My mother sat upright on the couch, expression unreadable, and Brandon lounged nearby with his laptop open. "Sit," my father said. I did my hands clasped tightly in my lap. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You know what you need to do. Sign the estate over to me. I'll manage it properly. You'll get 10%. That's more money than you'll ever need." My heart pounded in my chest. 10%. I repeated, my voice small. My mother gave a tight smile. "That's $700 million, sweetheart. You'll live comfortably. Leave the responsibility to your father." Brandon leaned forward. "She doesn't even know how to run a company. She's a music teacher, for God's sake. Don't be selfish, Lauren." The word hit harder than they knew. "Selfish," I said softly. "Grandpa made this decision because I wasn't." My father's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, towering over me. "This isn't about choice. It's about loyalty. You either sign the transfer or you walk out that door and don't come back." The room blurred for a second. I thought of the long afternoons at Grandpa's house, his laughter echoing through the halls, his lessons about integrity, about never letting money decide who you are. I took a deep breath and said one word: "No." The reaction was instant. My mother shot to her feet, her voice sharp as glass. "You ungrateful girl. After everything we have done for you, private schools lessons, every opportunity, you dare throw this family away." Brandon's laugh was cold. "Enjoy being rich and alone. You'll come crawling back once reality hits." But it was my father's whisper that cut the deepest. "If you walk out of this house tonight without signing, you are no longer my daughter." I looked at him, searching for something, any sign of the man who used to fix my bike when I was 10, who once drove hours to hear me play at a recital. There was nothing, just ice. "I guess I've been gone from this family for a long time," I said quietly. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm, and dragged me toward the front door. "Pack a bag," he ordered. "You've got 30 minutes. After that, the locks change." My mother's heels clicked behind us as she shouted after me to remember who fed me, who paid my bills. I didn't answer. I walked down the hall to my old room, pulled open drawers that still smelled faintly of lemon polish and youth, and filled a duffel with whatever fit. When I stepped back into the foyer, my father was waiting with the door open. "Out," he said. The night air was cold, the porch light spilling a harsh circle around us. My mother's voice followed, brittle and high. "Money won't keep you warm. Family is forever." I turned, meeting her eyes. "Then why did you just throw me away?" She didn't answer. The door slammed, the sound echoing down the quiet street. For a moment, I stood there holding the strap of my bag, unsure where to go. Then my hand found the small brass key in my pocket, the one Grandpa had given me months earlier with a quiet smile. "Someday you might need this." The engraved initials felt warm against my palm. I walked to my car, the night stretching wide and empty, but the thought of that house, his house, pulled me forward. The drive to his estate took nearly 2 hours. The road wound through dark stretches of pine and open fields until the iron gates rose ahead, tall and familiar, the family crest gleaming faintly under my headlights. My chest tightened as I stopped before them. Without Grandpa, the place felt different, bigger, quieter, like a cathedral that had lost its priest. Still, when I slid the key into the lock, it turned smoothly. The gates opened with a low groan and I drove through. The mansion stood at the top of the hill, its windows lit softly like it had been waiting. I parked by the front steps and climbed out, my shoes crunching on gravel. The air smelled of cedar and rain. When I pushed open the heavy door, the scent of lemon polish and old wood wrapped around me. The foyer gleamed under the chandelier's light. For a moment it almost felt like coming home. Then a voice came from the shadows. "Miss Lauren." I froze, nearly dropping my bag. A tall man stepped forward, silver hair brushed neatly back. "Arthur Blake," he said with a small nod. "Your grandfather asked me to stay on. He told me if anything happens, protect Lauren. She's the true heir." I swallowed hard, emotion rising before I could stop it. "I thought everyone would be gone." Arthur shook his head. "Not everyone. Mr. Ellis planned for this. There are letters, instructions, things you'll need to see. His lawyer will arrive tomorrow." He led me to the study where a fire already crackled in the hearth. "He told me this house must always be ready," Arthur added softly. "He said one day you might need a safe place." I sank into the old leather chair, the warmth seeping into my skin. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I felt the edge of safety, but the feeling didn't last. My family would come for me again. I could almost hear my father's voice promising that this wasn't over. I looked at the fire and whispered to myself, "Let them come." I had nowhere else to run, but here, at least I wasn't alone. That night, I slept in the guest room where I'd stayed as a child. The sheets smelled freshly laundered, and a book I'd left on the nightstand years ago was still waiting a ribbon, marking my last page. As I turned off the lamp, the house creaked softly as though it recognized me. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more battles, but for the first time I wasn't scared. I was home. I woke to the sound of voices drifting up from downstairs, faint but unmistakably human. For a moment I lay still, wondering if I had dreamed them, but then Arthur's calm tone carried through the hall. "Miss Lauren," he called softly. "You have a visitor." I sat up, brushing the sleep from my eyes. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, painting the walls in a muted gold. When I reached the landing, I saw Arthur standing at the front door beside a familiar figure. Stephen Cole stepped inside his briefcase in hand, his expression serious but warm. He looked around the entryway with a kind of reverence, like someone walking through the memory of a friend. "Your grandfather trusted me with more than his will," Stephen said, as Arthur led us toward the study. "He trusted me with you." The words carried weight I wasn't sure how to hold. He set the briefcase on the mahogany desk and unlatched the brass locks. Inside was a thick envelope sealed with my grandfather's initials. "He left you letters," Stephen said. "Guidance instructions, and if you'll forgive the term warnings." My hands shook slightly as I broke the seal. The first page began in my grandfather's familiar, steady type. "Lauren, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know your father will come for you. Do not yield. I have prepared for this moment." I kept reading, my throat tightening with each line. "You will not stand alone. I have gathered people who care for you, people who will protect you when blood turns against you. Trust them as you trusted me." Before I could ask what that meant, Arthur returned with a woman in her late 50s, her cardigan dusted with flour, as if she had just stepped out of a kitchen. "This is Marie Holloway," Stephen said, "your grandfather's housekeeper, and in truth, a part of this family." Marie smiled and pulled me into a hug that smelled faintly of sugar cookies and soap. "Oh, Lauren," she murmured, "you look just like your mother did before money hardened her. Your grandfather adored you." She laid a leather folder on the table. "These are journals your grandmother kept, records of every visit, every argument, every kindness. They explain why your grandfather made his decision." I opened one carefully. The handwriting looped across yellowed pages, neat and familiar. Thomas came again asking for money. When we refused, he called us ungrateful. Lauren arrived later with soup and stayed until William's fever broke. I turned another page, each entry cutting deeper and healing at once, proof of years I remembered only as feelings. Before I could speak, another knock echoed down the hall. Arthur opened the door for a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a bun and a laptop bag over her shoulder. "This is Elena Cruz," Stephen introduced. "Your grandfather's business partner. She knows every corner of the Ellis Holdings." Elena gave a firm handshake. "He wanted you to understand what you've inherited, not just the money, but the people it supports." She opened her laptop, the screen filling with charts and ledgers. "Hundreds of employees depend on the company your grandfather built. He trusted you to carry that responsibility with care." My chest tightened. Until that moment, I hadn't thought about the lives attached to the empire now in my name. I had been so focused on surviving my family's anger that I forgot there were others watching what I would do next. By midday, more allies arrived, faces and names I had heard only in passing. Leonard Wu, the investment advisor who had managed the family's portfolio for decades, brought thick binders filled with transparent records. Pete Alvarez, the estate and security manager, explained the updated systems my grandfather had installed last year, from reinforced gates to hidden cameras throughout the grounds. And finally, Judge Samuel Brooks, a tall man with gentle eyes, arrived carrying a single folder. He greeted me like an old friend, though I'd only met him once when I was a child. "Your grandfather asked me to act as a neutral witness if disputes arise," he said. "I won't allow his wishes to be twisted." The study filled with the rustle of paper and the low murmur of discussion. For hours, they walked me through everything my grandfather had done to prepare how he had documented every transaction, every statement, every visit from my father after the funeral. It was as though he had seen the future unfolding and built a wall to protect me from it. When the last folder closed, I sat back in the leather chair, the fire crackling softly beside me. "He knew this would happen," I whispered. Stephen nodded, resting his hand over mine. "He did. And he believed you'd be strong enough to face it." Arthur stood near the doorway, shoulders squared. "Your father came here once already," he said quietly. "Tried to take jewelry and documents. I stopped him. He won't stop for long." The words settled heavily between us. Elena shut her laptop with a decisive click. "Then we'll make sure you're ready when he returns." The room fell silent except for the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, people my grandfather had trusted with his life, people who had chosen to stand with me now. They weren't my blood, but they felt closer than family. I felt something inside me settle, not peace exactly, but a steady calm. That evening, after everyone left, I wandered through the mansion's quiet halls. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch as I passed familiar eyes painted in oils that had outlasted their owners. I paused in the music room where the grand piano gleamed under a low light. Dust motes floated in the air like memory. I ran my fingers along the keys, pressing one softly. The note lingered clear and pure. For the first time since the will reading, the sound didn't echo against emptiness. It felt like an answer. I slept lightly, half aware of the creaks and sighs of the old house. At dawn, the smell of coffee and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Marie was already at work, humming softly as she poured batter into a pan. "Eat something before the day starts," she said without looking up. "You'll need your strength." Through the window, I saw Pete adjusting something near the gate, his truck parked just beyond the hedge. The calm felt deliberate, like the stillness before a storm. By 9 o'clock, everyone had returned. Stephen spread documents across the dining table, highlighting clauses and signatures that confirmed the will's strength. Elena projected data showing the company's steady growth and clean audits. Leonard reviewed trust accounts and charity endowments my grandfather had established quietly over the years. Judge Brooks sat by the fireplace, silent but watchful. The mansion felt alive again, its walls humming with purpose. I stood beside the window, my palms slick, my heart pounding harder with each minute that passed. "They're coming," I said quietly. Arthur met my eyes from the doorway and nodded once. Moments later, the sound of tires on gravel broke the morning calm. Several sleek cars rolled up the drive, engines idling like predators waiting to pounce. The pounding on the door made the chandelier tremble. "Open up, Lauren." My father's voice thundered from outside. "This nonsense ends today." I felt every muscle in my body tighten, but I nodded to Arthur. He turned the handle and opened the door wide. My father strode in first, his face flushed with anger. My mother followed, her lips pressed into a thin line, her perfume sharp in the air. Brandon lingered behind them, hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes darting from face to face. "This is still our house," my father barked. "You have no right to shut us out." I took a breath and stepped forward. "Grandpa gave this to me. Legally, morally, every way that matters." Brandon snorted. "Don't play innocent. You manipulated him. Everyone knows this fortune belongs to the family, not to some piano teacher." Stephen stood calmly holding a folder. "Mr. Ellis," he said, "your father anticipated these accusations. He left signed statements, video testimony, and independent evaluations proving his full mental capacity." He placed the papers on the table. "Contest this and you'll lose." My father's hand twitched toward the folder, but before he could speak, a deep voice cut through the air. "That won't be necessary." Judge Brooks rose from his seat, his tone quiet but firm. "Your father asked me personally to oversee any disputes. The documents are airtight, Thomas. You have no legal claim." The color drained from my father's face, replaced by fury. He pointed at me, trembling with rage. "Ungrateful girl! You're tearing this family apart." I felt my voice shake but didn't lower it. "You did that long ago when you chose money over love." My mother's composure cracked. After everything we gave you, private schools, lessons, vacations, you repay us like this? $7 billion belongs to the Ellis family, not to you alone." Marie stepped forward quietly, holding a small box. "Actually, Mrs. Ellis," she said softly, "your daughter belongs here more than anyone." She handed the box to Stephen, who opened it and pulled out a page in my grandmother's handwriting. Thomas demanded money again. When we refused, he shouted that we were stingy. Lauren came later with soup and stayed until William's fever broke. The words hung in the room like a bell's final note. My father's jaw clenched. My mother froze, and Brandon slammed his hands on the table. "Enough. We don't care about your stupid journals. Just sign the transfer, Lauren. Grandpa would have wanted me to succeed." Elena's voice sliced through the tension. "Your grandfather gave you every chance, Brandon. He stopped funding your ventures because you never earned it." His face turned crimson. "You think you're better than me?" he snapped. "You'll fall apart without us." I straightened my shoulders, the fear gone. "I don't think so," I said quietly. "For once, I'm not the one begging." My father's shout filled the room. "This is garbage. None of this changes the truth. That fortune is mine by right." Judge Brooks's voice boomed, final and unyielding. "Your father's will is the law. You have no claim." And then Arthur stepped forward, holding a small silver drive. "Mr. Cole," he said evenly, "you may want to show them this." Stephen connected it to Elena's laptop. The screen flickered, showing footage from the mansion's cameras, my father, mother, and Brandon rifling through drawers after the funeral, stuffing jewelry and documents into bags. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The voice from behind us, firm official, made her freeze. Context won't matter in court. We turned to see Sergeant Mark Douglas, standing in the doorway, uniform, neat arms crossed. "Theft is theft," he said. My father's shoulders sagged. My mother's eyes filled with panic, and Brandon muttered a curse. I stood still, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. "I'm done being afraid of you," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "Grandpa trusted me to protect what he built. You can yell threaten or steal, but you'll never take his legacy." The silence that followed felt endless until my father spoke, his voice hoarse. "If you go through with this, you're no longer part of this family." I met his eyes. "You made that choice when you tried to destroy me." One by one they turned and left their footsteps echoing down the marble hall. When the last door slammed, the mansion exhaled, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Stephen placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stood your ground." I nodded, though my chest ached with something deeper than victory. The house was finally quiet, truly quiet. The sound of the rain outside softened and the fire in the hearth burned steady. For a long moment I stared at the doorway where my family had stood, the air still trembling with their absence. Then I looked at the people around me. Stephen, Elena, Arthur, Marie, Leonard, Judge Brooks, all waiting not for thanks, but for what came next. I drew a slow breath, the weight of everything settling into something firm. "All right," I said softly. "Let's begin." The quiet after they left felt heavier than their shouting ever had. For a long time, no one moved. The fire in the study burned low, its soft crackle filling the space they'd emptied with anger. I stood where my father had pointed at me minutes earlier, the echo of his threat still ringing in my ears. My chest rose and fell steady, but tired. Around me, the others began to exhale too, as though we'd all been holding the same breath. Stephen gathered the scattered papers from the floor, stacking them neatly again. "You did what needed to be done," he said quietly. I nodded but couldn't find words. The next few days blurred together in a rhythm of calls, documents, and signatures. Stephen handled legal filings while Elena met with department heads across the company, ensuring that operations continued without interruption. Leonard spent hours at the long dining table reviewing accounts and setting up new authorizations under my name. Every evening, Marie brought trays of coffee and warm bread, refusing to let anyone work hungry. The house hummed with motion, not chaos, but focus, each person doing their part, as if my grandfather had orchestrated it long before this day. Arthur kept close watch over the grounds, adding extra locks to side entrances and reprogramming the gate codes. Pete oversaw security footage and background checks for staff uncovering that my father's assistant had attempted to access restricted files. We filed a report through Stephen's office, tightening every weak spot in the estate's defenses. The work gave structure to the storm that had passed. Yet even with everything running smoothly, I felt the quiet ache of what had been severed. At night, when the house finally went still, I would sit by the grand piano in the music room. My fingers rested on the keys without playing. The space still held the faint scent of cedar polish and my grandfather's cologne. Sometimes I thought I could hear him turning pages beside me, waiting for the next measure. One evening as I sat there, Elena appeared in the doorway with a gentle smile. "You should come see this," she said. She led me to the library where the others had gathered around a large map spread across the table. It showed every property the Ellis Foundation owned, schools, clinics, shelters, each one marked with small, handwritten notes from my grandfather. "He wasn't just leaving money," Leonard explained. "He was leaving purpose." Stephen handed me a folder of documents stamped and ready. "This foundation now falls under your name. He wanted you to guide its future." I traced a finger along the ink lines connecting small towns to city centers, realizing how far his reach extended. "We'll need to restructure," Elena said, glancing at me. "Some programs rely too heavily on old partnerships your father influenced. We can fix that." Her voice carried confidence but also respect. I nodded slowly. "Let's start there." He built this to help people, not to impress them. For the first time, giving direction didn't feel strange. It felt right. The days grew longer as spring edged toward summer. The mansion, once echoing with grief, began to fill with new sounds, voices, footsteps, laughter. Staff who had stayed loyal returned, and local families who had known my grandfather came by with flowers and handwritten notes. Marie arranged them along the hallways, saying the house needed life again. One afternoon, she found me in the study signing more documents. "You're running yourself ragged," she said, setting down a tray of tea. "Even your grandfather took time to sit by the fire." I smiled faintly. "I'm trying to make sure everything's done right." She patted my shoulder. "That's exactly what he would have said." Despite the progress, the strain lingered. My father's attorneys sent letters threatening lawsuits, each one more desperate than the last. Stephen met them all with calm professionalism. "They can bluster all they want," he told me. "The evidence is ironclad. Eventually, they'll run out of leverage." Still, every new envelope made my stomach tighten. The thought of another confrontation kept me awake at night. One morning, as sunlight broke through the kitchen windows, Arthur walked in with a small smile. "You have a visitor," he said. My heart leapt before he added, "Not family. Someone who used to work for your grandfather." A woman stepped forward, maybe in her late 40s, carrying a thin folder. "I'm Clara Hayes," she said. "I was one of the scholarship recipients through the Ellis Foundation 20 years ago. Your grandfather changed my life. I wanted to say thank you." She handed me the folder. Inside were photo students in classrooms, smiling faces, new buildings built with foundation grants. "We all owe him more than we can say," she told me. "I heard you're continuing his work. If you ever need help running outreach programs, I'd be honored to volunteer." Her words reached a part of me that had stayed quiet through all the legal noise. I asked her to stay for coffee, and by the time she left, I knew she would be part of the foundation's future. That evening, I gathered everyone in the dining hall. The table that had once hosted tense meetings now glowed under candlelight. "My grandfather believed wealth was a tool, not a throne," I began. "It's time we use it that way again." We spent hours drafting plans for expansion, more scholarships, new community partnerships, better protections for employees. As the conversation flowed, laughter replaced tension, and by the end of the night, the mansion felt alive in a way I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Weeks passed, and the work began to show results. News of the revived Ellis Foundation spread through local papers, painting the picture of a young heir honoring her grandfather's values. Donations increased. Former employees returned. The business side of the empire stabilized under Elena's direction, while Leonard's careful investments built a safety net for future projects. Even Stephen, normally so reserved, smiled when he read the latest reports. "You're doing more good in a few months than most people manage in a lifetime," he said one afternoon. Still, there were reminders of what I'd lost. My phone lit up with messages from my parents and Brandon apologies wrapped in excuses, promises to start over if I'd reconsider. I didn't reply. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined me. The house that once felt like a fortress had become something softer, a place of work, laughter, and purpose. One night after a long meeting, I stepped out onto the terrace. The sky stretched wide and clear, the air warm against my skin. Down below, the gardens shimmered under the soft glow of lanterns. I thought of my grandfather, of how he used to walk these paths at dusk, hands clasped behind his back, humming under his breath. "We build not to be remembered, but so others can stand taller," he once said. The words returned like a whisper on the wind. Behind me, the house lights flickered softly as Marie closed the curtains for the night. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs and steadies your thoughts. The battle with my family might not be over, but for the first time I didn't fear it. What we were building here was stronger than greed could ever undo. When I turned back toward the study, I saw a single envelope on the desk, delivered by courier that evening. The return address was familiar, my father's law firm. I hesitated, my hand hovering over it. Whatever was inside would decide the next chapter of this fight. I slipped it into a drawer, deciding to face it in the morning. For now, I let the silence settle, the fire's glow reflecting off the piano in the next room. The melody waiting there would keep until tomorrow, and so would the storm that letter might bring. Morning light filtered through the curtains when I finally gathered the courage to open the envelope that had been sitting on my desk overnight. The seal broke with a quiet snap, but the words inside hit with force. It was from my father's attorney, written in the clipped, confident language of people who never expect to lose. The letter accused me of mismanaging the estate, of exploiting my grandfather's employees for personal gain. Attached was a draft of a formal motion, an attempt to petition the court for protective oversight of my inheritance. In plain terms, they were trying to paint me as unfit, hoping to wrestle control away under the guise of family concern. I sat there for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. Then I folded it neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and walked downstairs. The others were already gathered in the study. Stephen was on a call. Elena stood beside the window reviewing reports, and Leonard was scanning spreadsheets with a pencil tucked behind his ear. I placed the envelope on the table between them. "It started," I said quietly. Stephen ended his call and picked up the letter. His expression didn't change as he read, but the tightness in his jaw gave him away. "They're trying to force conservatorship," he said, handing it to Elena. "They'll claim you're incapable of handling the responsibility." She skimmed it quickly, her tone dry but steady. "This won't hold. We have documentation proving otherwise." Leonard looked up from his notes. "And the Foundation's accounts are spotless. They can't argue with clean numbers." I exhaled slowly. "Then we fight." Stephen nodded once. "We'll prepare a formal response and submit it before the end of the week. But I think it's time the public sees who you are and what you're doing with this legacy. Transparency will make their claims crumble." The suggestion startled me. "You mean an interview?" He smiled faintly. "A story on your terms. Your grandfather's company had a reputation for integrity. Let's remind people of that." The following afternoon, we met with a journalist named Dana Pierce, a calm, perceptive woman who had covered several of my grandfather's philanthropic projects in the past. She arrived at the mansion with a notebook and a camera crew, her tone gentle but professional. "I'd like this to focus on the Foundation's mission," she said, "not on the feud." I nodded, grateful. That's exactly what my grandfather would have wanted. The interview took place in the music room. The piano gleamed under the soft lights, its polished surface reflecting the quiet fire burning in the hearth. Dana asked about the programs we'd launched, the scholarships awarded, the clinics funded. I spoke about my grandfather's belief that money was meant to build, not to divide. At the end, she asked one final question. "If your family's watching, what would you say to them?" I paused, feeling the weight of the cameras, then said simply, "I hope someday they remember who he was and why he built all of this to help others, not to fight over it." When the interview aired 3 days later, it spread faster than anyone expected. The segment showed not scandal or arrogance, but quiet work images of children in new classrooms, community centers, opening their doors, and the Foundation's logo rising like a promise on banners across small towns. Donations surged overnight. Letters arrived from people my grandfather had helped years ago, their words filled with gratitude and memories. Even Stephen, who rarely allowed himself emotion, admitted the response was remarkable. But not everyone was pleased. My father's lawyer filed the motion anyway, citing public manipulation and claiming I'd turned charity into spectacle. We received notice that a preliminary hearing would be held within the month. The weight of that date hung over everything we did. The nights grew longer, filled with documents, witness statements, and strategy sessions. Through it all, the house remained a hub of quiet determination. One evening, as we sat reviewing affidavits, Marie entered with a stack of mail. "This one's handwritten," she said, placing a small envelope on the desk. It bore no return address, only my name in careful script. I opened it and found a short note. "Your grandfather would be proud. Don't let them take what he trusted you with." It was unsigned. I slipped it into my pocket, a reminder that there were still people who believed in what we were doing. The weeks that followed tested us in ways none of us expected. Reporters camped at the end of the driveway, hungry for conflict. My parents released statements through their attorneys, calling me young and misguided. Brandon gave a radio interview where he called me a temporary custodian of wealth that belonged to the family. Through every headline, we kept working. Elena and Leonard ran operations at the company, ensuring payroll and contracts never faltered. Stephen coordinated the legal filings, and I traveled quietly to meet the people who'd been touched by the Foundation's work. In a small town 2 hours away, I visited a new community center built with Ellis funds. The building still smelled of paint and cedar. Children were playing in the yard, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. A teacher named Nora showed me the classrooms and the art supplies they'd purchased with our grant. "Your grandfather's dream didn't die with him," she said. "You're proving that every day." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night, headlights cutting through the dark. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. We gathered in the courthouse conference room, stacks of files and evidence ready. My father and mother sat across the table, both impeccably dressed, both refusing to look at me. Brandon avoided eye contact altogether, tapping on his phone until the judge entered. The session was short but intense. Stephen presented documentation, financial records, letters, footage from the mansion's cameras, everything proving my capability and their earlier misconduct. Judge Brooks, serving in oversight, confirmed the evidence himself. When it was over, the petition was dismissed. Outside the courthouse, the air felt clearer than it had in weeks. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but I kept walking. Stephen fell into step beside me. "It's done," he said. "They can appeal, but they won't win." For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe it. That evening, the mansion felt different, lighter, alive. The team gathered in the dining hall for a simple meal. Marie lit candles, Arthur poured a single glass of my grandfather's favorite wine, and we raised it in his honor. "To integrity," Stephen said softly, "to carrying the name the way it was meant to be carried." Around the table, heads nodded, smiles formed. It wasn't triumph or gloating, just relief and quiet pride. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone in the study looking at the painting of my grandfather that hung above the fireplace. The firelight caught the edges of his smile, and for the first time I felt something close to peace. The house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a living place again, a heartbeat steady under its walls. But even as the flames crackled low, I knew this chapter wasn't entirely closed. My father's pride would not let the loss rest easily. Somewhere he was planning his next move, and I could almost sense it in the stillness. Yet the fear that used to follow that thought was gone. We had built something solid, truth-proof, and a circle of people who believed in the same legacy. Before turning in, I opened the music room doors and sat at the piano. My hands found a melody without effort, soft and slow, one my grandfather had loved. As the notes filled the air, the mansion seemed to breathe with me. For the first time, the sound didn't echo back with loneliness. It stayed warm and alive. When the last note faded, I closed the lid and stood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to memory and calm. I turned off the lights, leaving the faint reflection of moonlight across the piano's surface, and whispered into the quiet, "We're still standing." The next morning began with sunlight streaming through the library windows, soft and golden, as if the house itself was exhaling after weeks of tension. For once, the air didn't feel heavy. The hearing was behind us, and the foundation had found its rhythm again. Reports came in showing scholarship applications, doubling small businesses reaching out for partnerships, and local schools asking to host music programs. Yet peace never seemed to last long in my world. By noon, the phone rang, Stephen's name flashing on the screen. His voice was calm but clipped. "Lauren, I just got word from a contact in corporate security. Your father's been moving company assets tied to the old Ellis accounts. It looks like he's trying to undermine your foundation's funding streams." For a moment, the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "Can he do that?" I asked. "Not legally," Stephen replied, "but he's disguising the transfers under a dormant subsidiary. We'll need to act fast." Within the hour, Elena and Leonard were seated across from me in the study, laptops open, phones pressed to their ears. "He's clever," Leonard muttered, scrolling through the data. "He's not taking money directly. He's creating bottlenecks, delays in supply contracts, and redirecting supplier credits through shell entities." Elena's eyes narrowed. "It's meant to choke the foundation's liquidity without leaving fingerprints." I felt my stomach knot, but my voice stayed steady. "Then we'll trace it back and make it public." Stephen arrived by evening, his briefcase full of files and updates. He looked exhausted, but his focus never wavered. "If we move first, we can freeze these transfers and protect your grandfather's assets," he said. "But this will expose everything your father's done. Once we file, there's no going back." The room fell quiet. Outside, the sun dipped behind the trees, the light spilling amber across the marble floor. "Do it," I said finally. "He's had every chance to stop." That night, as the others worked late downstairs, I walked through the garden alone. The roses my grandfather had planted were in bloom, their scent faint in the cool air. I thought of how carefully he'd built everything, every brick, every company, every value he'd passed down. For a moment, I wondered what he'd think of the battles that now defined his legacy. The stars above the estate shimmered faintly, and I could almost hear his voice reminding me to stay the course. By morning, Stephen's team had filed the injunction. Within hours, news outlets began calling, picking up fragments of the story. A wealthy family divided a daughter fighting to protect her grandfather's legacy from internal sabotage. Cameras returned to the gates, reporters stationed along the drive. Marie kept the blinds drawn, while Arthur monitored security feeds, but the phone lines didn't stop ringing. "Ignore the noise," Elena advised. "We'll handle the legal side. You focus on the foundation's work." Still, the chaos seeped through. Anonymous emails arrived, some supportive, others cruel. One evening, as I sorted through paperwork, Brandon's name appeared on my screen. His message was short. "You've gone too far. Dad's ruined because of you." I stared at it for a long time before closing the laptop. For all his recklessness, he was still my brother, and a small part of me wished he'd understood that this wasn't revenge, it was preservation. A week later, the court issued its decision. All transfers halted the Ellis Foundation's assets, secured under independent oversight. The ruling confirmed what Stephen had predicted. It wasn't just a win, it was a public rebuke of my father's actions. News channels reported it as a cautionary tale about greed and power, and for the first time, public sympathy shifted firmly toward us. Donations soared again, and a major technology firm reached out to fund a new initiative for educational programs. The tide had turned. Despite the victory, the mood in the mansion stayed subdued. None of us celebrated. We just exhaled quietly, each person knowing how much had been lost along the way. That evening, Stephen joined us for dinner, a rare break in the middle of all the demands. Marie served roasted chicken and vegetables, the kind of simple meal my grandfather would have loved. The conversation was easy, gentle, filled with the small laughter that had been missing for months. When the plates were cleared, Stephen lingered by the fire. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled this," he said softly. "Most people crumble when faced with this kind of pressure." I met his gaze and nodded, though the compliment felt heavy. "He gave me everything I needed to survive this," I said. "He taught me what matters." Stephen smiled faintly. "And you remembered." Later that night, I returned to the study to finish signing endowment documents. Outside, rain had begun to fall, tapping gently against the windows. The sound was steady and familiar, like a metronome marking time. As I reviewed reports, I noticed one name repeated: a school district in Virginia, applying for a grant to start a youth orchestra program. The proposal included a note from a teacher: "We want our students to believe that music still matters." I couldn't help but smile. My grandfather would have approved. A few days passed and the tension finally began to ease. The legal battle was over, the foundation secure. The house that had once felt like a fortress was now open to visitors, again students, board members, local partners. Each new face brought a sense of renewal. The walls no longer echoed with confrontation, but with quiet purpose. One afternoon, Clara Hayes returned the former scholarship recipient who'd visited weeks earlier. She carried a small box wrapped in linen. "I found something at the old office archives," she said, placing it on the desk. Inside was a framed photograph of my grandfather standing beside a much younger version of herself at a scholarship dinner 2 decades ago. On the back, in my grandfather's handwriting, were 4 words: "For those who build forward." Clara smiled. "I think he meant you, too." That night, I walked to the halls of the mansion, the sound of my footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. The portraits on the walls no longer felt like watchers, but witnesses, quiet reminders of the line I came from and the one I was choosing to create. The fire in the study still burned low, a soft glow against the darkness. Before heading to bed, I paused at the piano in the music room. My fingers brushed the keys lightly, drawing out a few quiet notes. It wasn't a song, just a thread of sound to fill the stillness. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and new. For the first time since my grandfather's passing, the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. But just as I turned off the lamp, Arthur appeared at the doorway, his expression uneasy. "Miss Lauren," he said quietly, "there's something you should see." He handed me his phone. On the screen was a news alert, one that made my breath catch. My father had given an interview claiming that the Ellis Foundation had been built on false pretenses, that he possessed proof my inheritance was obtained through manipulation. The calm that had settled over the house fractured in an instant. I set the phone down slowly, the room spinning around me. "When was this released?" I asked. "Half an hour ago," Arthur replied. "It's already everywhere." I stared at the flickering fire, its light reflecting off the piano's surface. The peace I'd felt moments earlier faded into resolve. We had faced battles before, but this was something else, a final attempt to rewrite the truth itself. I straightened my voice steady. "Tell Stephen and Elena to come first thing in the morning. We'll answer him, but in our own way." Arthur nodded and stepped back into the hallway. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the night sharp and still. The next fight was already beginning, but this time I wasn't afraid of it. As I turned out the lights, the piano reflected one last glimmer of firelight, like a promise that no matter what came next, we were ready to face it. By sunrise, the headlines had already spread. Every channel, every news site carried the same story: my father's accusations that my inheritance was the result of manipulation. He claimed I'd deceived my grandfather in his final years, turning him against his own family. The statements were sharp, rehearsed, and deliberate. When Arthur brought in the morning paper, his jaw was tight. "They've gone all in, Miss Lauren," he said quietly. "He's naming names, filing complaints. It's not just talk this time." I sat at the table in the study, the newspaper open in front of me. My father's photograph dominated the page, his expression grave, his tone painted as righteous concern. He had always known how to use charm when he needed it. Beneath the image, a single line stood out in bold: "I fear my daughter has been influenced by those who seek to control the Ellis fortune." I read it twice, my hands still. Then I folded the paper neatly and set it aside. "Call Stephen and Elena," I said. "We'll meet within the hour." By mid-morning, the mansion was alive again with movement and voices. Stephen arrived first, calm as always, carrying a folder thick with notes. Elena followed, her coat dusted with rain. Leonard came a few minutes later, setting his tablet on the desk. "The stories everywhere," he said grimly. They've gone to financial outlets too, implying fraud. Stephen took a slow breath. We'll respond with facts, not anger. But we'll need to make this public on our own terms. Elena nodded. A press conference, she said. Neutral setting, controlled access, everything recorded. We release the proof, the videos, the letters, the audits. No spin, no hostility, just truth. Her voice carried calm authority, the same tone my grandfather had trusted for decades. I turned toward the window, where the sky hung heavy and gray. Then that's what we'll do. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Stephen's team gathered every document tied to my grandfather's estate, cognitive assessments, signed statements, video records. Elena compiled years of financial data and philanthropic records showing every dollar accounted for. Leonard cross-checked filings, ensuring that no shadow of doubt could remain. Marie and Arthur managed the household, quietly fielding calls and keeping the estate secure. Through it all, I felt strangely steady, as though fear had burned itself out. On the morning of the conference, the mansion was still before dawn. I woke early and walked the garden path where my grandfather once took his morning strolls. The roses had faded, their petals curled and pale, but the air still held that faint scent of earth and memory. I stopped at the small bench he used to rest on and traced the worn armrest with my fingers. You told me to stand my ground, I whispered softly. I'm keeping that promise. By 9 o'clock, we were downtown at the conference center. Reporters filled the room, cameras lining the back wall, lights harsh and unblinking. Stephen stood at the podium first, his voice calm and measured, as he recounted the facts, the will's authentication, the court rulings, the audits confirming every asset's transparency. He laid the documentation on the table beside him for any journalist to review. Then he nodded to me. I stepped forward, the microphones crowding close. For a heartbeat, the noise of the room seemed to fade. I could almost hear the echo of the piano at home, one steady note that grounded me. My grandfather raised me to believe that integrity outlasts rumor. I began. His estate was his final act of trust, not a tool for division. Every action I've taken since his passing has honored his wishes and protected his work. What you see here today is proof of that, his own words, his own voice, recorded by him, not me. At Stephen's cue, the screen behind us lit up. The footage showed my grandfather sitting in his study speaking directly to camera. His voice filled the room, warm but firm. If you are watching this, it means my will is being questioned. I made my decision with full clarity. My son and daughter-in-law have lived comfortably through my support. My granddaughter Lauren is the one who carries forward our name's purpose. The video ended and silence fell over the room. Then the reporters began asking questions, voices rising, flashes bright. I answered each one, calmly repeating what my grandfather had already made clear. By the time the conference ended, the tone had shifted. The story was no longer about scandal, it was about evidence. Networks replayed this video, analysts commented on the clarity of the documentation, and online messages of support began to flood in. The damage my father tried to do unraveled under the weight of my grandfather's own words. That evening the house felt different again. The air was lighter, not with triumph, but with quiet relief. Marie prepared dinner for everyone who had stood by me through it all. We gathered in the dining hall where candles flickered against the polished wood. Elena brought a bottle of wine she said had been waiting for the right occasion. Stephen raised his glass. To William Ellis, he said, and to the granddaughter who carried his name with honor. We toasted softly, the glasses clinking in the warm light. Arthur smiled from his place near the door, and even Leonard, usually so reserved, let out a quiet laugh. For the first time, the weight on my chest eased. The people around this table weren't bound to me by blood, yet they were the truest family I'd ever had. After dinner, I stepped outside. The night was cool, the garden quiet except for the hum of crickets. In the distance, the city lights flickered like faraway embers. Arthur joined me on the steps holding a folded newspaper. They printed a retraction, he said. Your father's claims were dismissed. His investors are pulling out. It's over. I took the paper from him but didn't open it. It doesn't feel like a victory, I said softly. It feels like an ending. Arthur nodded. Some endings are the same thing. He paused before heading back inside. "You did right by him, Miss Lauren. He'd be proud." When the house grew quiet again, I returned to the music room. The piano waited in the same soft pool of light, its lid-open keys gleaming. I sat down and began to play one of the songs my grandfather loved best, slow, steady, the kind of melody that seemed to speak without words. Each note filled the air, gentle but certain, and for a moment I could almost feel him standing beside me. As the final chord faded, I rested my hands on the keys and looked toward the window. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. The fight was behind us now, the noise, the accusations, the long nights of defense. What remained was the legacy he'd trusted me to protect. I closed the piano lid quietly and whispered, "It's safe now." The room settled into stillness, the kind that feels earned. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings, but tonight belonged to peace and to the man who had believed in me enough to leave me his name. The morning after the press conference, the mansion felt unusually still. The phones were quiet. The reporters had drifted away, and the sky over the garden glowed a soft pink. For the first time in months, I woke without the sound of tension humming through the walls. Downstairs, the scent of coffee and warm bread filled the air. Marie had been up early humming the same hymn she used to sing when my grandfather was alive. I stood by the window watching sunlight catch the edge of the old fountain, and it struck me that peace could feel both strange and sacred after so much noise. Stephen arrived just after breakfast, holding a small envelope sealed in deep red wax. "It came this morning," he said, placing it in my hand. "From the archives at Turner & Grant. It's the last of your grandfather's letters." The wax bore the family crest, 3 stars, and a single oak leaf. My throat tightened as I broke the seal. Inside, on thick cream paper, was my grandfather's familiar handwriting. "Lauren," it began. "If you're reading this, the storm has passed. I never meant for wealth to divide, only to test the hearts it touched. If you've held fast to what is right, then my trust was not misplaced." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest. "He always knew how to speak to me," I whispered. Later that afternoon, we gathered in the garden for the first board meeting since everything had ended. The foundation's banner hung behind the table, its motto embroidered in gold, "To build, not to possess." Stephen reviewed reports. Elena announced new partnerships. Leonard outlined the next phase of community grants. When it was my turn to speak, I looked around at the faces that had become my family, steady, loyal, bound by more than contracts. "My grandfather believed that success isn't what we take," I said quietly, "but what we leave behind. This place, this mission, is our way of keeping him alive." Applause wasn't loud. It was soft, sincere, the kind that fills the heart rather than the room. That evening I returned to the cemetery. The air was cool, and the leaves had begun to turn rustling softly underfoot. I carried a single white rose and his final letter now tucked safely in my coat pocket. The headstone caught the last light of day, simple, elegant, etched with his favorite line, "Honor is wealth that cannot be stolen." I knelt, placing the rose gently at its base. "It's done," I said aloud. "They tried to twist your legacy, but it's safe now. The work you started will go on." A breeze moved through the trees, scattering a few petals across the grass, and for a fleeting second it felt like an answer. When I got home, the house was quiet again. The fireplace in the study burned low, its light casting familiar shadows across the shelves. I sat at the piano, running my fingers across the keys before letting them fall into an old melody, one my grandfather had taught me when I was a child. Each note seemed to carry the weight of the journey we'd taken together, the loss, the fight, the forgiveness I was still learning to give. As the final chord faded, I realized that music, like love, leaves echoes that never really die. Over the next few weeks, life settled into something new. The foundation's work expanded faster than any of us expected. New schools opened, mentorship programs began, and families wrote letters sharing how those grants had changed their lives. The house, once a fortress, became a place of laughter and purpose again. Arthur often joked that it finally sounded like a home. Sometimes I caught myself listening for my grandfather's footsteps in the hallways, and though they never came, the stillness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the tall windows, I found myself standing at the grand staircase, looking at the portrait that had started it all. His eyes, painted in gentle tones, seemed almost alive, watching, maybe even proud. "We made it," I said softly. "Your name stands for something good again." For the first time since he'd gone, those words didn't ache. They felt like peace. And maybe that's the truth about legacy. It isn't measured by numbers on paper or the size of an estate. It's measured in what we build with what we're given in courage that holds when others falter, and in choosing to protect what's right, even when it costs us comfort. My grandfather's fortune had once felt like a burden, but now I understood it had been a map, a way to find my own strength. As evening fell, I walked out onto the veranda. The sky stretched wide and gold, the kind of light that makes everything look forgiven. The fountain murmured softly, and the scent of roses drifted through the air. I closed my eyes, listening to the calm. If my story has taught me anything, it's that peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from knowing you did what was right when it mattered most. Wealth fades, titles shift, families fracture, but dignity endures when you guard it with truth. So if you've ever had to stand alone to protect something you believed in, I hope you find strength in that too. Because sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that change everything. And if this story stayed with you, take a moment to share it, or simply sit with it, and remember, legacies aren't about money. They're about the love and integrity we leave behind.